Before the presentation with an old EU joke. I was trying to find a new one, but I haven't found any that are as funny. And I still think it's funny today. There are many permutations on this joke. I hope you agree with me. The joke goes like this. It's a bit long, but what is the definition of heaven and hell in Europe, in the European Union? Okay, let me begin with heaven. Heaven is where the French are the chefs, the British are the police, the Germans are the mechanics, the Italians are the lovers, and everything is organized by the Swiss, who, as it happens, are not in the EU. That probably tells you something as well. Hell, however, look at the reverse, is where the French are the mechanics, the British are the chefs, the Germans are the police, the Swiss are the lovers, and everything is organized by the Italians. My apologies to any Italian Americans or Italians in the audience. You're really getting it today, but I believe the ability to laugh at oneself, even employing national stereotypes, and I've heard this joke, these sort of jokes throughout Europe for many, many years. I think that in itself is an achievement of the European Union. And I hope the new and the prospective members in the EU, those from my region, my part of the world, Central Eastern Europe, can also learn to do likewise without either breaking off bilateral relations or starting a new war. I do exaggerate, but anyway. I think let's start with the presentation. Let me begin by saying that Europe, as a multinational institution, we're talking about the European Union, of course, is a work in progress. Although, of course, at times there seems to be a lot of work but little progress, but, you know, this happens. Nevertheless, I would say in the past 3 years in particular, remarkable progress has been achieved, particularly in terms of European Union enlargement. And I want to stress the importance of that for my part of the world, Central Eastern Europe. And the absorption of many, if not all, not yet all, of the new post-communist democracies from Central Eastern Europe. I think the map tells you quite a bit. I would say that the prospect and the reality of EU entry has helped to ensure the success of political, legal, economic, and other forms of transformation in each of these countries. It has boosted their economic performance and competitiveness and their democratic credentials. And it has also expanded and strengthened the security of the European Union itself. This, I believe, is the European Union's most important foreign policy achievement over the past decade. And if you have a look at the map, 8 countries, together 10 countries have joined the EU from my region. In fact, 10 out of the 27 EU members are now former communist states or new democracies. All 10, of course, are also NATO members, and I'll talk a little bit about NATO later on. If I could have the next slide, please. As you see, the combined population of the EU is, and I did this myself, so apologies for the PowerPoint graphics. The combined population, as you see, is almost 500 million. The combined population of the Central European members is just over 100 million, basically, now with the entry of Romania and Bulgaria. And there are three kinds of states, I would say, in terms of size. The largest, two of the largest, Poland, 38 odd million, Romania, 22 million. Medium-sized states, which include Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Slovakia. And the smaller ones, the 3 Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, as well as Slovenia, the first of the former Yugoslav republics that's in the European Union. A couple of points, next slide please, a couple of points I want to make, inevitably I have to, a couple of points on EU institutions that the EU countries have entered. I don't want to bore you with this, I'm sure you know it off by heart, all the institutions in the European Union. You have to relearn it every year because you forget, but anyway. All I would say really at the outset is that although the EU has a number of common institutions, it does not possess authoritative, executive, and legislative branches. The Council of the European Union is the main decision-making body, but its responsibilities and operations, particularly in the field of foreign and security policy, which I really want to focus on, are still evolving, to be generous. The presidency of the Council is held for 6 months by each EU member state on a rotational basis, thus complicated consensus building and decision making. Some of the Central European countries, Slovenia, for example, will have the presidency at the beginning of next year. The question is how much they have a heavy agenda, but how much they can accomplish in that period is certainly in doubt. In terms of the EU Commission, as you can see, it consists of nationals from every member state, but they are not elected. The Commission's president actually chooses the commissioners from 3 nominees given by the member states, and the list is then approved by the European Parliament. You could say it's sort of indirect democracy. The Commission proposes legislation on which the European Parliament and the Council of the Union can decide. It was basically created to represent the interests of the member states. And although it has right to take initiatives, most of its proposals, from everything I've seen, are either legal obligations or requests for action by other specific institutions within the European Union or by specific member states. Next slide, European Parliament. I want to run through these quickly because I don't want to bore you. The European Parliament is a relatively weak body. As you see, the total membership over 700, 28% are from Central East European region. Now, the European Parliament, which is directly elected in the member states, does not really initiate laws and does not control significant resources. Although several member states, particularly the smaller ones, would like to see its authority enhanced. And although the EU's constitutional treaty was intended to reinforce the Union's democratic credentials by giving more powers to the European Parliament, I think it still remains unclear whether, even if this was achieved, whether this would actually enhance or undermine the development of a common foreign policy. And debates are ongoing whether the European Council, the Council of Ministers, the Commission, the Parliament should be strengthened in determining foreign policy. The larger states have generally favored the stronger council, European Council and Council of Ministers, in which their state sovereignty is upheld and their power as larger countries is enhanced. While many of the smaller members, as I've mentioned, would prefer a more effective European Parliament and European Commission. Now, during the debates on the Constitutional Treaty, we've heard about this. The Constitutional Treaty actually failed in Western Europe, not in Central Eastern Europe. Most of the Central European countries that held referenda actually passed. I remember actually landing in Riga on the day that the Parliament, the Latvian Parliament, passed the EU Constitution on the day that the French rejected. So debates on the Constitutional Treaty in Central Europe have changed, I think, over the years. I don't think there's real opposition to intensified integration, but there is resistance to 2 issues, I think. One, the creation of an avant-garde or a, let's say, core group within the European Union that would determine security and defense policy, i.e. a Franco-German axis. And the other question is how effective will the European Union be? In other words, opposition that, let's say, resistance to the European Union undermining NATO without giving anything effective in its place. Third issue actually is, of course, US relations. I'll come to that as well. Now, the failure of the EU's constitutional treaty amongst the older members has increased, of course, confusion over the future of the Union's foreign and security policy. In sum, I would say this: the EU's foreign policy and security apparatus has exercised very limited influence over the policies of individual governments. Although the European Council makes pronouncements on external affairs reflecting the consensus of the member states and provides a general framework for action by the Commission and the ministers, member states are not bound to follow its policy directions. Hence, we continue to see divisions and sometimes major divisions over significant foreign policy questions such as relations with Russia and, of course, relations with the United States. Next slide, very quickly. It just gives you an idea of these countries, which commissioners are from which of these new member states, Central European states. Okay, you've read it. Next slide, please. I want to go through, because I see I'm already halfway through, and I'm not halfway through this yet. But let me now turn to the core of my presentation, which is the priorities of the Central European, foreign policy priorities of Central European countries. Now, these are the ones I've listed. I mean, these are the key issues, I think, that they would not like to see the EU weaken. In fact, if anything, they want to see the EU uphold and strengthen. First of all, strong transatlantic relations. In other words, to keep the United States closely involved and engaged in Europe, militarily, politically, economically, and other ways, as they do not see, quite frankly, that the West Europeans are an effective force, let's say, haven't assembled an effective force or have the will to defend their security and national interests if there ever comes a day when they are threatened. Secondly, a common EU policy, in other words, a common policy that does not alienate the United States or does not increase insecurities within Europe's borders or along those borders. Thirdly, effective security in which the European Union, this is absolutely key, in which the European Union does not duplicate or weaken or sideline NATO without providing a genuine, credible alternative. And then the last two issues, which I'll come to in a moment, Nicholas dealt with, I think, the southern dimension very well. I want to mention the eastern dimension. Eastern dimension, in general, means a focus on bringing the rest of the former Soviet satellites and the former Soviet republics, European Soviet republics, into both European Union and NATO. And the southern dimension basically means completing the incorporation of the Balkans within European institutions and also within NATO. Next slide, please. Now, however, there isn't one single Central East European policy, just as there isn't one single older member West European policy. There are divisions, and what I've tried to do is to group them, and I've more or less classified them into two groups. And many analysts have actually in the region have actually criticized the Central European countries for not developing and implementing a common strategy. You know, despite talk of new Europe, old Europe, the divisions, I think, are much more complex. Instead, I would say each capital is always, I would say, pursuing essentially its own discrete, separate national strategies. And I think it's become clear that they do not form a bloc. There is not a united body within the European Union of the former communist states, the new democracies. And the two groups I would mention are the Baltic Group and the Central European Group. And I'll go through this very briefly. If I could have the next slide, I think that goes into, yeah. The Baltic Group, and again, the countries, the three Baltic republics and Poland. Poland is on the Baltic Sea, including as a Baltic group. It's a convenient way of classifying. The Baltic Group certainly feels more vulnerable to pressure from a resurgent Russia. It is more assertive in trying to focus EU policy on the eastern dimension, in other words, bringing in its neighbors to the east into the European and transatlantic fold. And seems more, let's say, active in its commitment to the transatlantic relationship and a strong American presence in Europe. And these countries have pushed to mobilize support within the European Union for a more effective eastern dimension. The European Union has something called the ENP, the European Neighborhood Policy, which is applied really not just to the former Soviet republics, former communist states, but also to North Africa, Mediterranean region, even some of the Middle Eastern countries. And it's seen as being really too weak, too disparate, too vague about membership prospects, and really not being enticing enough to offer a genuine path towards the European Union. Hence, the Baltic Group in particular criticizes the ENP or wants to see the ENP enhanced with some more firmer additional engagement by the European Union with a promise of membership, of course, if these countries meet membership criteria like the Central Europeans have. Now, maybe look at the next slide, which is the Central European Group. In contrast, I would say several of the Central European countries, and by Central European countries, Central European Group, I mean Slovenia, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia, they've adopted, I would say, a more circumspect position in their Eastern policy. and tend to be more focused on the deepening of EU integration, on pursuing their economic development. Much, of course, depends, these are general trends, much, of course, depends on the political profile of member governments, but I'm stating sort of general trends that are visible over the past few years since the collapse of communism. Romania and Bulgaria, whether they fit in, I think Romania is likely to fortify the Baltic Group. It, of course, has its own very specific Eastern dimension interests, particularly in Moldova, but also vis-à-vis Ukraine. It has a very strained, or has had a very strained relationship with Russia, and does see Russia as more of an immediate threat to their interests. And it's trying to develop a Black Sea policy, a very, let's say, ambitious Black Sea policy, sometimes maybe too ambitious, in trying to draw in some of the Caucasian republics, Georgia, maybe even Armenia and Azerbaijan, closer towards NATO and the EU. So those are the basic divisions. I don't want to go too far and say that they're in conflict over this. No, these are national priorities which inevitably have diverged over the past few years. Okay, I've caught up a little bit. Next to, I've got maps. The Eastern dimension, actually the Southern dimension don't show, but this is the Eastern dimension, which of course includes Russia, but not Russia as a potential EU or NATO member. I don't think any serious politician in Central Eastern Europe is pushing that. What I think they are pushing is to try and make some of the West European countries and West European institutions understand the potential danger that a resurgent Russia poses along the borders of the European Union and NATO. So these countries in particular, Ukraine, Belarus and Moldova, as you see right next to the Central European states, are of primary concern. Just as Germany was very much concerned about stabilizing Poland, bringing Poland into the EU, bringing Poland into NATO, so Poland is very concerned about Ukraine and Belarus. In other words, Polish national interests here coincide with EU national interests. It's to try and stabilize the neighborhood. Now, next slide. What I want to turn to now, next slide actually is another map. So, yeah, go to the next one because Nicholas covered that very thoroughly. Okay. What I'd like to go into a little bit here is, given the distinct and diverse agendas that I've outlined in Central Eastern Europe, but also diverse agendas in Western Europe amongst older member states, how do these countries pursue their national interests? Given the fact that the EU is not a multinational federation, but it's a sort of loose confederation of nation states. I think all the Central European countries are now learning, sometimes painfully, sometimes with a lot of criticism, but they're learning to be coalition builders on issue-specific interests with not only with their neighbors, but with the older members. Now, these temporary issue-based coalitions cross-cut the Union. They're dependent on very specific policies, very specific national interests, as well as the profile, the leanings, political leanings of the government in power. And I've listed a few, there are many others. Foreign policy, security policy, of course, budget structure and how they benefit. Every country wants to benefit, of course, as much as it can. Economic policy in terms of economic models. We've heard a lot about economic diversity, even in terms of economic models, let alone economic productivity in the European Union. Agriculture, of course, subsidies. A common energy policy, which is a huge issue now and a growing issue. And I think a useful example here of how these cross-cutting issue-based alliances now operate in the European Union is the case of Poland. Let me just run through a few issues. For example, on budgetary issues, Warsaw tends to align itself with countries such as Spain rather than the UK, as it seeks to benefit from EU subsidies. Rather than countries such as France, Germany, or UK. On economic policy, it is aligned with the UK and its more liberal economic model rather than the more social model pursued by France and Germany. On agriculture, Poland is actually closer to France, seeking a continuation of the CAP, the agricultural subsidies. On security and defense policy, of course, Poland has, and I think will continue to align itself with the UK, particularly vis-à-vis the United States, rather than France and Germany. So this gives you an indication of how cross-cutting interests or specific interests of particular countries cross-cut different alliances. I could have drawn you a diagram of this, but it would have been very complicated. Next slide. Now, given the national divisions, institutional complexities, cross-cutting interests, all these things that I've tried to outline, let me list a few of the sort of problems that will preoccupy both the old and the new member states over the coming years, and they're very important to these new members. First of all, will there be further EU enlargement? And of course, as we've heard this morning, other than the West Balkans, which have in a way a commitment to integration, this will necessitate institutional reform within the European Union itself to be able to absorb new members. Secondly, will the EU constitution be revised? Will it be resubmitted? Or will parts of it be incorporated in other treaties and legislation? And that's a long-term process. It's not going to happen overnight under the presidency of any single member state. Thirdly, and again, we've heard a lot about the economies, can economic growth and global competitiveness be sustained given the demographic and productivity problems that Europe faces? Will a common and effective security and foreign policy emerge? I've already talked a little bit about this. We can talk a bit more in questions and answers. What would be the long-term impact of immigration and xenophobia, which I think is rising in parts of Europe, and the clash between secularism and religious traditionalism in parts of, now in Western Europe, but it may even affect parts of Central Eastern Europe. Next, how will the EU's relations with Russia develop, given the opposition of some of the EU newcomers in extending this current partnership and cooperation agreement that the European Union has with Russia, given what are perceived as Russia's negative policies in the region? And of course, last but not least, how will the transatlantic relationship evolve? Much, of course, depends not just on Europe, but on us, on the US administration here. And very lastly, a very last slide, I'm going to mention a few issues which I think are very important in terms of the transatlantic relationship and how the US-EU relationship will evolve in the coming years. The Central European countries are trying to become more important players within the European Union. Now, I personally think that the United States hasn't invested enough in maintaining, in enhancing and developing that relationship. And in some respects, I think this administration has taken some of the Central European countries a little bit too much for granted. There is, of course, a very tight cooperative past between the Central Europeans and the United States in terms of America's contribution to the liberation from communism and the Soviet Empire. However, new generations are coming to the fore. There is now an uncertain future, I would say, in terms of memories of America's role in liberation from communism. It's no longer a question of the Cold War, it's post-communism, it's democracy building. And inevitably, the process of Europeanization for the new generation is going to take priority. I mean, a lot of the students now go to West European universities rather than American universities. They work, they live, they can travel, they live, and they can even work now in West European countries. Aside from a few Polish plumbers, but that's changing as well. So America as a beacon of freedom and democracy, I think, is fading a little bit. And we cannot live on the past. We have to invest in the future. And there are fears that in some quarters that the decline in that relationship between the Central Europeans and the Americans will also contribute to further pulling apart the United States from Europe in itself. So, and it's good to self-promote. I've just published a book with my deputy, Ilona Teleki, on precisely this relationship between America and the Central European states. And in it, we offer a number of recommendations of what can be done to try and enhance, strengthen, develop, and move that relationship forward so that we have good, reliable allies in the future. Not allies that do whatever we say, but good friends who tell us when we're right, who stand with us when they think we're right, but who can also tell us when we're wrong. And I think I'll stop there because I'm just on the dot. Thank you very much.